been some time since I sailed around the world on this clipper, the most beautiful ship on the oceans. This episode describes the journey from Rio to the southeast of South America, Puerto Madryn. In Rio, we were confronted with the horrifying history of slavery, a history whose traces you can see in the country even today. But we sailed on to relive Darwin's discovery of the gigantic fossil mammals of South America. The end of this journey brought us to a place that I long to see, one of the ocean's delivery rooms. But let's go to the start, our arrival in Rio. In September 2009, I left Plymouth in England to embark on a great adventure. I was invited to set sail with the clipper Stad Amsterdam and make the same journey that the young naturalist Charles Darwin undertook 179 years ago. The Beagle's circumnavigation of the Earth is the most important journey ever made, far more important than man's voyage to the moon. And I will be repeating this journey together with Darwin's great-great-granddaughter, Sarah. It's a chance of several lifetimes. We are approaching Rio de Janeiro, the Sugarloaf Mountain, the Corcovado, the gigantic statue of Christ. Everybody knows them, and seeing them usually conjures up images of pleasure and excitement. But when Darwin set foot in Rio, things looked quite different. I may mention one very trifling anecdote, which at the time struck me more forcibly than any story of cruelty. I was crossing a ferry with a Negro who was uncommonly stupid. In endeavoring to make him understand, I talked loud and made signs, in doing which I passed my hand near his face. He, I suppose, thought I was in a passion and was going to strike him, for instantly, with a frightened look and half-shut eyes, he dropped his hands. I shall never forget my feelings of surprise, disgust, and shame at seeing a great, powerful man afraid even to ward off a blow, directed, as he thought, at his face. This man had been trained to a degradation lower than the slavery of the most helpless animal. Slavery was abolished nearly 2 centuries ago. But the question still remains, how did some members of the human race feel superior to others, just because of the lighter color of their skin? Brazil being a so-called racial melting pot, it is a good place to try and find answers to this question.
The guessing game.
She could be my aunt, this one, but then it's a little Mediterranean touch.
This guy with the bandana who's coming up, he definitely, a lot of African.
Oh, yeah. West African, Senegal or something,
Yeah.
very black.
A lot of Portuguese, a lot of Spanish, Western European. There's this guy who looks more African, but he could be carrying a Y chromosome like yours. It's entirely possible.
It doesn't look like carrying a Y chromosome like mine.
While I take a well-earned nap to pretend to reflect on how my hero would have viewed our world as it is now, his great-great-granddaughter sets out again this time to try to discover the history of the slavery that so shocked Darwin. A small, barely visible sign indicates that this is where the slaves were offloaded. The old slave market has become a small park. The auction building, where slaves were offered to the highest bidder, stands in ruins. In April 1832, Darwin wrote that some days after his arrival, he was invited to visit a plantation. Hundreds of slaves from Africa labored on this estate. Immediately, at the first halting place, Darwin is filled with disbelief at the sight of the rock from which an escaped slave jumped in an attempt to get away from her pursuers. While Sarah relives her great-great-grandfather's experiences, I contemplate my own ancestry. I feel particularly white here in Rio. What do I know of my own history? How can I find out?
The interesting thing is, because of the history of human migration, how we've moved around the world, these sets of shared markers are localized regionally, okay? And so that's how we can say how people moved around. So, for instance, the deepest split in the human family tree is found only in Africa. They accumulate additional changes in their DNA, and ultimately it comes down to the present day. So we look at people who are alive today, we study these markers, and we can infer the pattern in which they occurred, the order in which they occurred, and where they're found in the world, and that allows us to trace these migration routes all around the world.
How much of our DNA is different from me and you, for example? It must be a tiny part, I guess. Or?
Yeah, it might surprise you. We're 99.9% identical. So these differences that we think of as being so deep-seated, deep-seated biological differences between races, as people taught for many, many years in physical anthropology classes, they're literally only skin deep. They're very superficial.
From a distance, it seems so simple. White is originally European, yellow is from the Far East, black is originally African, and all that lies in between could be Indian or a mix. But of course, it isn't like that. One could do an endless amount of research into this racial melting pot. DNA research. My shipmates find themselves in a former refuge for slaves, with a view of one of the wealthiest parts of Rio.
Meu tataravô aqui chegou antes da abolição. Nesta terra se assentou, começou a evolução. Aqui ele plantou, aqui ele colheu.
Together with his son, Zacopan sings about life in a quilombo, the name given to these enclaves. They live here with some 30 others, and all of them are of slave descent. In order to move upwards on Brazil's social ladder, one clearly needs to be or to become as white as possible. The slaves' descendants seem to have pursued this ideal, but Zacopan wants to be as African as he possibly can. Through DNA research, he wants to find out how much African blood he has, a man after my own heart.
Eu tenho muito orgulho das minhas origens, tenho muito orgulho das minhas raízes.
To gather information about his ancestry, Zacopan must give a sample of his saliva.
Quilombola, sou rei Congo, sou zumbi. Sou o ai da resistência, não quero sair daqui. Sou a raça brasileira que sofre humilhação. Sua história verdadeira construiu essa nação.
Eu tô ansioso, né? Existe uma ansiedade, porque de repente eu posso ter descendente de algum sheik aí, cheio de grana.
In the meantime, I too have become involved with some DNA research. Together with two Belgian scientists, I am on my way to a favela in order to collect snails.
So Redmond, have a look at this. This is full of snails.
It's for research into a tropical parasite, Bilharzia, a worm that lives and reproduces inside snails and can be transmitted to humans.
When you just come in contact with water for a couple of minutes, they will penetrate the skin, and they will migrate to the lungs, and then to the liver. And in the liver, that's where the males and the females will pair.
Wow.
And they will lay eggs. These are causing the real disease.
In an area like this, 100% or 60% of the children will be infected. So usually even 100%. So the prevalence is very high. They are somewhat sick, but they don't feel well, they don't do well at school, they have diarrhea.
Back on board, we can take a close look at the snail and the parasite. An unpleasant little creature, when you realize it infects some 200 million people a year.
Look at this. We have a Cercaria. It's a bit slow now, but usually they are very rapid in the waters. They can swim around and they are actually looking for a human skin. And when they find the skin, they penetrate, they will go with the bloodstream to the liver and to the intestines, where they will establish themselves again as adult worms.
Suddenly, a horrible feeling comes over me.
I've swum all over the Congo, including in lakes and in the Amazon in stagnant water sometimes, because not for fun. That's the only way to wash, and you get desperate for a wash in the jungle.
Now you get scared.
Yeah, you bet.
Well, we can help you, actually.
Because, of course, I feel tired all the time.
Even if you would have been infected 20 years ago, you might still be carrying the infection.
Yeah, it would be 20 years ago or more.
So you can actually detect the molecules of the parasite which they vomit.
It gets worse and worse, so my blood is full of worm puke.
It might be, and we have now, because this worm puke actually also gets into the kidneys and into the urine. So even for intestinal cases, we can now detect it with just looking with a dipstick in urine. I have a Wedgwood cup here, to have a pee in this, and we will test it afterwards.
All right.
We have here...
Perhaps not. I go and pee.
Milky?
Tem llaves?
Eu não sei como é que abre. Tá fechado?
Trancado, Beto.
Trancado, seu Beto.
Milky?
This one's particularly beautiful. There's all these lovely lichens all over it.
In Brazil, it is inevitable that the painful past will one day bubble up to the surface. And historians like Dr. Liliana Brito are taking it upon themselves to document the story of slavery and the resulting traumas. She has discovered an interesting place.
Eles têm a história muito interessante de que um antigo senhor de escravos doou essa terra para um ex-escravo seu e eles eram alforriados. Isso antes da abolição, 1870 e poucos. E eles mantiveram essa terra.
Lídia, eu queria que a senhora contasse um pouco o que seu avô falava sobre a escravidão.
Ele falava assim, de escravidão, que ele já sofreu muito na escravidão, já apanhou muito lá, né? Aí sobre o negócio da comida, era aquela comida, aquelas lavagens.
The history of slavery in Brazil is closer to the present than we assume. This woman is 102 years old and was born exactly 20 years after the abolishment of slavery in 1888 to a mother who was a slave.
Eles apanhavam muito, os escravos que eram mal criados apanhavam. A mãe a avó do meu esposo, ela era bem escura, era forte. Mas ela fazia a pena, ela era cortadinha de chicote, de coisa cortada, e ela era mal criada, ela não aturava. Aí sofria, mas apanhava muito. Ai.
Brazil was the last South American country to abolish slavery. And when town criers were sent across the country to announce the liberation, they sang a song that still pierces the soul.
Tava dormindo, candongueiro me chamou. Levantem-se, apronta, cativeiro já acabou. Lá no cruzeiro tem boi que sabe ler. Bota a corda nele, traz aqui que eu quero ver. Isso eu jongo. Plantei café na carreira.
But the message of freedom, which this song is about, has never properly reached many Brazilians. Calling yourself black may still result in social expulsion.
It's difficult to affirm I'm black. It's difficult. Just people who has studied. I affirm my color when I entered in college, because in the past this is. Sorry. É difícil falar disso porque quando você se assume negro, você se assume discriminado. Você se assume pobre, você se assume uma pessoa com menos chances na sociedade. Então eu acho muito importante esse tipo de trabalho, esse tipo de iniciativa, porque sem isso essas pessoas não deixam simplesmente de existir na nossa sociedade.
By looking at your markers, we can tell you where in this tree you're found. So the results of that are that you're about 60% African. Okay? You're about 35% European. And you're about 5% Native American or Amerindian. So, like many other people in Brazil, you have a very mixed background.
Bem crioulo, não é crioulo inteiro, não.
Não, tem aí 15%. Não, tem mais 10%, 60%.
Tu vai perder esse quilombo aqui, meu amigo.
60%.
Vai perder o quilombo. Acabou. Tu é europeu, rapaz.
60% é coisa pra caramba, hein?
Ô, meu amigo, 40% europeu?
É muita coisa.
Que é o quê? É branco, rapaz.
Deixa agora eu... Eu sou meio emotivo mesmo, mas já tá passando. Já passou. Se me desse um pouquinho é bom. É legal.
What is the significance of the things we have seen? The continuing inequality based on skin color? Who knows, the problem might solve itself. Because, according to Spencer Wells, the real white man and the real black man will no longer exist in a few centuries' time. We will all have the same beautiful color, that of the mocha man. I will never be able to witness such a change. Besides, right now, I am more concerned about my own future.
It's almost time to look at your test. So what we see here...
That red line means what?
You do see a very weak line. So it looks like...
You're joking.
Yeah, no, I'm afraid not. But, so these
I am infected.
But it looks like you're a little bit infected. I mean, you are infected, yes.
Most of the people do not die from it or do not even get very sick from it. And this is a kind of survival strategy for the parasite itself, because killing off its host population, it's really no good for it. It's a bad idea for himself. So,
I'm not the only victim. 20% of the film crews tested appear to be infected.
19th of August, we finally left the shores of Brazil. I thank God. I shall never again visit a slave country.
On three. 1, 2, 3.
Here we are, absolute mirror of a society on a ship. Everybody has to cooperate, and the more you cooperate, the less you think about yourself, your own self-preservation, the better this ship, this society will do.
Here we are in Montevideo, and this is the place, apart from all its other virtues, where Darwin was supposed to have had a mistress. And I really hope he did, because the usual explanation for English gentlemen in the 19th century is that they never masturbated, of course, but they had a wet dream once a week when they were in their 20s, like Darwin, once a month, a bit older, and that kept you going. But here, he's away from home 5 years. As far as we know, no girlfriend, apart from perhaps here. While we happily reach Montevideo, Sarah is also on her way to the city. She has travelled overland, as Charles Darwin often did. The advantage being that in avoiding seasickness, he incidentally made all his seminal discoveries essential to the birth of his theory of evolution by natural selection. On this journey, he found gigantic skeletons and fossils of extinct animal species. He later wrote in his notebooks that the fossil mammals of South America, together with the animals of the Galapagos Islands, were the origin of all my views.
The discovery of the Toxodon for Darwin must have been a big moment because this was his first look into extinction. For natural selection to work, if you like, you necessarily have to have extinction as well. So this also probably put him on the map, maybe in the UK as a naturalist, and this would have given him sort of respect when he got back to the UK, that he was a bona fide naturalist who was capable of finding and making discoveries. And I think that was very important.
While travelling just on the land over there, for instance, he says, I received several vivid descriptions of the effects of a late great drought. And then he goes on to describe mass death of birds, wild animals, cattle and horses perished from the want of food and water. The fact that he's putting this into his description, into the voyage, straight from his journal, shows that he's already beginning to think, though he doesn't know it, to put his ideas into a hard form. And there's nothing quite so powerful as actually holding a piece of evidence in your hand, especially when you could hardly carry it and you need both hands to hold it. Like the bones that he discovered, that he pulled out of a little cliff face of the Megatherium, as we call it now.
Encontró las huellas que estaban muy descubiertas.
What an amazing sight.
Here we are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 trackways of sloth.
Do I take my shoes off?
No, but we
Be very
can
careful.
work very careful.
This is the only protection to this site.
Here we have one big footprint, Megatherium.
Megatherium, how amazing. Isn't it incredible? So how tall would the Megatherium have been? If he was standing here now?
About 3 and 4 meters.
3 or 4 meters.
He must have been astonished at the variety and the number and the size of these fossils. Now, the giant sloth, it was pretty obvious, the Megatherium, sat on its haunches and pulled trees down, whereas the three-toed sloth, now the little sloth that he also saw, just moved very, very slowly through the trees, crunching up leaves. Why? What had happened? What enormous changes this implied, and it also implied over a vast amount of time. It was all there in the biology.
How many kilometers of footprints do you think there are?
5 kilometers.
Fantastic.
Hace 12.000 años, el mar no estaba donde está ahora, sino estaba retirado. El clima era muy frío y muy seco. Al ser un clima tan seco, era un lugar especial para que los animales del lugar se acercaran a tomar agua. Entonces caminaban alrededor de esas lagunas tomando agua y quedaban las marcas de sus patas en el barro. Enseguida, por el mismo clima seco, se secaban estas lagunas y quedaban marcadas las huellas, que cíclicamente se producía otra lluvia que traía nuevo sedimento que tapaba las huellas anteriores, y así se formaban distintas capas con huellas. Podemos decir que una superficie de una capa es como una instantánea de tiempo.
While Sarah makes one discovery after another, I am left with no conclusion to my research into the romance Darwin is believed to have had in Montevideo. However, Darwin was also left empty-handed here. Back in England, his beloved tired of waiting and ended their long-distance relationship. And a good thing too. She was a fluff-headed, dancing party girl, quite wrong for him.
I think it would have been a terrible blow. But like all obsessed men, driven men, he probably just expected her to wait for 5 or 6 years. There was no end date given for the end of the Beagle project. How was she going to wait for 5 or 6 years in her prime breeding time? Couldn't be done.
The number of large fossil skeletons found in South America is impressive. Not only mammals like Megatherium, which died out 12,000 years before the present, but also huge skeletons of dinosaurs, which became extinct 65 million years ago.
So, Jorge, can you tell us what this is?
Okay, this is a part of the tail of a giant sauropod. It's a titanosaurid. We have the first 16 vertebrae of the tail, and this animal had 65 vertebrae.
Right.
So the length is more or less 30 meters, like the length of the shelter.
Yeah.
The shelter has 30 meters.
Yeah.
So this is the length of the animal. And we are describing this material because it's a new species.
A new species. And tell me, why is it so important that we should preserve dinosaur fossils and sites like this?
I think the importance is to know the past, how we live in the past. In this case, we preserve the dinosaurs to see how other animals lived 100 million years ago, 90 million years ago, and how was the fauna associated, and then to compare with the actual fauna.
"65 million years ago, an asteroid hit the Yucatan Peninsula and threw up so much dust into the atmosphere that the planet cooled, the climate changed, and the dinosaurs died out."
So do you think the dinosaurs were on the way out 65 million years ago and then the meteorite was the final straw, or do you think they'd have carried on strong for another few 100,000 years?
If the meteor hadn't hit,
yeah,
we were not here. The dinosaurs were alive.
Yeah, they'd still be alive, you
yes,
think? Yeah.
And more, I think they were more intelligent with ships, space to colonize the rest of the world, because 65 million years of intelligence. Now we have few thousand years.
After a few days' travel, we arrive at Bahia Blanca. This is where Darwin brought aboard the bones of the Megatherium, and religious Fitzroy told Darwin that not all animals had managed to get on board Noah's Ark, and so had drowned. Here, I finally meet the fascinating Teresa, who has come to the ship to see my copy of the Zoology of the Voyage of the Beagle.
Muy pocas veces habla de religión Darwin. Él habla más de ciencia y de hechos concretos que va viendo y que le cuentan y le están demostrando la realidad, ¿no? Cuando él empieza a ver que la vida cambió, tiene que haber empezado a pensar que lo que leía literal en la Biblia no era verdad. Y no tengo problema, porque yo pienso que, bueno, mi forma de ver la religión es algo muy especial. La Biblia es una metáfora. La evolución es mucho más mirable que la creación.
Yes.
Sí, sí.
Absolutely.
I say, I think I'm falling in love. She's wonderful. Anyone who's found so many extraordinary fossils. So, I just want to touch the hand that found the fossils.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I'll die happy.
And man, will he ever become extinct? Undoubtedly. The only question is, when and how?
So Redmond, when the human race does go extinct, what sort of stuff do you think they'll be finding a million years later? Well, whoever it is that finds it.
Well, I think it'll all depend on who replaces us. And I think it's bound to be the cockroach. So even if we eliminate ourselves with a nuclear holocaust, the cockroach will survive. And then a really intellectual species of cockroach will evolve. It'll be very curious about its predecessors, and it'll go looking for us. And it'll start digging in this site called Oxford, and there it will find, beneath the roads, it'll find 8 million books. Now, of course, all those beautiful books above ground, they'll have disappeared, but as 90% of those are theology, that won't matter very much. We have set off again on a journey that will take us 3 days to Puerto Madryn. This is where the whales gather to mate and give birth. I can't wait to get a glimpse of them.
The whales have gone somewhere else, don't blame them. The whales are sunbathing.
Ja, recht vooruit, daar.
Els, heel. Je hebt nog sommige duin waar die lichte wolk naar beneden valt, zeg maar, en dan helemaal aan de rechterkant van de duin. Dat steentje daar, zo links een beetje daar.
Ja, ik zal het twee spuiten.
Ja, start, yeah. Against that sunny dune there, the sunny cliff.
There was a curious spectacle of very many spermaceti whales, some of which were jumping straight up out of the water. Every part of the body was visible, excepting the fin of the tail. As they fell sideways into the water, the noise was as loud as a distant great gun.
We have now arrived at the shores of the Valdez Peninsula, home of whale researcher Diego Mariano.
This is what you would normally hear on a calm day here, when you know, there are whales just breathing and snoring. This sound, for example, is what we normally hear when we are sitting looking at the whales and we hear their blows or just the noise of their tails or flippers slapping on the surface. Sometimes they can even wake me up at night. And, you know, when you're sleeping here peacefully in a calm night, no wind, and suddenly you hear a big blow because there's a whale right next to the house. It's just an amazing thing to be woken up by a whale that is in your backyard. Cetaceans live in a world of sounds. You know, blue whales and fin whales can hear sounds for thousands of miles, and they can communicate probably important information such as where the food is. And because their sounds travel so far, whales from across the ocean can swim and join that whale that found a big swarm of krill, and they can all feed together. So we are now trying to have new updated recordings, and we want to make a comparison between the sounds we recorded this year to the sounds that were recorded in the 70s. There are changes in the way whales vocalize. They're talking louder and at a higher frequency. So they have been changing their vocal repertoire over the past 4 or 5 decades, and it may be related to the fact that the ocean is now a noisier environment.
That really is amazing, isn't it? Look at the size of those jaws. That's where the baleen plates would hang to filter out the krill and the plankton.
The anatomy is so clear with all the bones here. I keep looking at the arm here. It's exactly like a human. Well, different scale, obviously, but all the bones are exactly the same as in a human, and it just looks like a human hand as well.
Well, a bit classy Chinese fingernails on it.
Yeah, very. But yeah, you really have to look at the skeleton before you realise how close we all are. There's no reason why a whale should have an arm the same way that we did, unless it's evolved from the same common ancestor.
And what about its legs?
That's true. They should. I think it's supposed to have some little tiny remnants of legs. There's a panel here, actually. It's missing something. Here you go. So yeah, you can see the remnants of where the legs and the pelvis used to be. They're now just tiny bones hanging beneath the spine. But I think it's the perfect example of evolution, isn't it? The fact that they're still there, the remnants of the legs. So it used to be on land, then more and more time in the water, and the legs shrank and shrank because more streamlined without them, I suppose. And then now all that's left is tiny little. They're not even on the skeleton because presumably they lost it. But yeah, it just proves the fact that they were land animals, the fact that they still have what used to be legs. Well, I hope we see them in the water, but here with the skeleton, you really get a sense of how it's used.
The blackbirds, the petrels, they're feeding on the carcass together with the gulls, and sometimes they get so full of blubber that they cannot take off. So when we approach, you might see them running on the sand and running above the surface of the water until they can take off because they're so heavy with blubber from the whale.
In the last few years, we have had exceptional high mortality rates. Like last year, 2008, there were 100 dead whales in the peninsula, and in 2007, there were 83. In many cases, when we find the dead whales for the first time, they're already like this. They're very decomposed. Some of the whales that we see dying are very skinny. Like last week, we necropsied a baby that had this much blubber, which is nothing. They should have at least this much blubber by this time of the season. And so some of the whales that are dying are very skinny, so they could be undernourished, and we don't know exactly why that's happening. There could be something going on in their feeding grounds. There are different reasons why the krill populations may be dwindling in the Antarctic. One is climate change. Krill overwinters under the ice, and if something wrong happens to krill in Antarctica, then something wrong happens to all life in Antarctica.
In the meantime, I'm searching, together with Anthony, for the so-called killer whale. In fact, a dolphin, the orca. It appears that here they even attack on the beach.
I used to always call them killer whales. It seems like these days people are calling them orca more and more. Which do you use? You call them?
Call orcas.
Orca.
Orcas.
Okay.
I don't like killer whale.
You don't like the term?
No, I prefer orcas.
Why don't you like it?
Because the orca is a dolphin. It's no
not
killer.
A whale. Yeah, and it's, well, it does sound like a killer. It's coming up here, killing all the elephant seals and sea lions.
No, but they are eating.
That's true. They're not killing just for fun. Yeah, okay.
Besides, you've given them all names, so they're your friends, aren't you?
Yes.
And who is your favourite?
Mel.
Yeah.
Mel is a big male.
Yes.
He's here in 1974, 75.
Wow.
Yes, sometimes we can see the orcas try to practice in this beach without the elephant seal or sea lions. Yes.
That's
it's very interesting.
Spooky.
Yes, it's very interesting.
That's scary. And any minute now, this great monster, this monster killer, Mel, is going to appear.
We'll have to run up the beach.
And he's an old fat man, yeah.
Yes, well, coming up the beach. We've seen the video footage of how Mel the orca operates. It's an astonishing sight. Still, we'd really like to see him, and we wait on our spot. But Mel isn't hungry today, or he doesn't trust us. He refuses to come to the beach.
It's Mel. Mel's come. Well, that's really scary.
Two shipmates are allowed to go swimming with the whales. A wonderful experience. It's extraordinary that Darwin, the greatest of all observers, was so useless at sea. He mentions whales and dolphins only twice. However, he does describe sealers and whalers in every port. It is possible that by the time he reached this coast, most of the whales and seals had already been slaughtered. We almost drove whales to extinction. We now appear to have saved them from ourselves.
Redelijk spectaculair.
Amai.
En dat is daar een kleintje.
Ja, en je ziet hoe sierlijk dat hij is.
Ja, ja.
Dat is het.
Ik vind dat wij nu gedaan hebben, is dat storend voor het dier? Of,
Ik denk dat we als zwemmer die echt storend zijn. Ik denk dat het voor ons meer interesse is.
ja. Maar in principe, als je er rustig bij komt, kan dat eigenlijk maken.
Ik denk dat niet zo.
Want er moet altijd een limiet stellen. Je massatorisme van maken. En zien hoe dat je de walvis benadert.
As to the idea of low life on the ladder of God, that the white race was separate and superior to the black race on a series from the primeval worm to the angels, Darwin's theory released us from such nonsense. Homo sapiens is one undivided species. There are no ladders or rungs in the process of the evolution of life.